Hello, Book Week Scotland. This is Peter May here, calling you from a sunny, well, in fact, it is a very sunny afternoon here in France. I've just had lunch in the garden, believe it or not. 31st of October, I'm recording this, and it was 21 degrees out there, so rather nice. Makes up a little bit for the fact that we just went back into lockdown in France yesterday. Second time this year, or confinement they call it here in France. So it was kind of a rough time in the spring with everything shut down, and here we are again in what predictably is now being known as the second wave. Anybody who knew anything about viruses and viral pandemics would know that there was bound to be a second wave, just as there was with the Spanish flu virus more than 100 years ago in 1918. I'll come back to that in a little bit. I'm here, I've been asked to talk about my book, Lockdown. I'll tell you a little bit about how that came to be published, because it's a book, it's very strange. It's a book I wrote 15 years ago in 2005. I was going through quite a difficult period then as a writer. I had just finished the China series, or at least my publishers had drawn a line on the China series, and didn't want any more of that. I had to come up with something new. And the first thing I wrote, believe it or not, at that point, now this must have been about 2004, was an idea that had been percolating away in my mind for some years. A story set on the Isle of Lewis, where I had spent a number of years during the 1990s producing a Gallic soap opera called Macha. I'd got to know the island very well, and I felt that it was something I could write about with some authority. And so I wrote a book called The Black House. And at the time when I wrote this book, I was pretty much convinced it was the best thing I'd ever written. But lo and behold, I couldn't find a publisher for it. Nobody wanted to publish it. Nobody. It was, my agent sent it to every publisher in Britain, and every single one of them rejected it for all sorts of different reasons. They all said they loved it, but they didn't see how they could sell it. They didn't think it would fit the marketplace, or whatever publishers come up with as reasons for not publishing things. They managed to come up with it. Nobody said it was a rotten book, that it was badly written or a poor story or anything like that. Quite the contrary. But still, nobody wanted to publish it, and that was tough for me, because at that point, I'm trying to make a living as a writer of books. I've scraped by with 6 books in the China series, which were by no means bestsellers. They were very much middle-list books that were just about scraping me a living, just about. I mean, I was spending a lot of money on research for those books, because I was back and forwards to China on a regular basis. So there wasn't much profit in it for me. And I'd spent a year working on The Black House. I'd gone back up to the islands to do my research specifically for this book. I'd written the book and then couldn't get it published. So I was in kind of a fairly parlous condition at that point. It's not easy when you're relying on income from a book to pay your bills, effectively, put food in your mouth. And so I had to come up with something else. And the book that I came up with was again something that I'd been toying with for some time. It was called Extraordinary People, and it was the first book in a projected series about a character called Enzo MacLeod, who's an expat Scot, or half Scot, half Italian, brought up in Scotland, now living in France, who attempts to resolve a number of very famous French cold cases by using new science. He was a forensics expert in Scotland. And the first of those books was called Extraordinary People. So I spent another year working on that, a lot of research involved in that. I was all over France for my research for it. And guess what? I couldn't get it published. rave reviews from all the editors who read it, but again, nobody seemed to think that there was a marketplace for it. One of the publishers said to me, "Enzo's too old to be a hero in a book." I mean, the character was like 50 years old at that stage. We were about the same age as I was at that point. So I was quite offended by this. But, at the end of the day, nobody would publish it. So two books in a row, I'd spent 2 years writing and had no income and a lot of outgoings. So I was in a really parlous state by this point. So it was difficult. I didn't know what to do. I had to make money fast, and I thought, I've got to write something fast. I've got to come up with an idea that I can write fairly quickly. And I came back dredging through my recollections of ideas. You go through ideas all the time when you're writing books. You something occurs to you, you think, well, that's a good idea, and then you look at it closer and put it to one side, and you move on to something else. Well, I'd had this idea while I was writing the China series, and it was the advent of SARS, if you remember SARS, which was about 2002, 2003, which was an epidemic which threatened to become a pandemic, which came out of China. And SARS was a coronavirus. And at that point, I was thinking, gosh, wouldn't it be interesting to set one of my China books in Beijing during a SARS pandemic or a similar virus to SARS pandemic, when the city is locked down and our main character Li Yan, and his sidekick, if I can call her that, Margaret Campbell, the American pathologist, would be investigating and forced to deal with a murder in a very difficult situation where basically society as we know it had shut down. Now, my then publishers in their wisdom pulled the plug on the China series, and so that never came to pass. But it was in my mind, and I thought, when I was looking around for this idea that I could latch onto fairly quickly, I thought, well, okay, let's take that idea, but we'll not set it in Beijing. We'll set it somewhere that I'm more familiar with, a major Western capital city, London. So having chosen London as the setting, I thought, well, SARS is past. It kind of mutated itself out of existence, or into a kind of much lesser threat. And so I started doing some research into what scientists thought might produce the next pandemic. And what the consensus of opinion at that time was, everybody thought it was going to be bird flu, avian flu. And this had been bubbling away kind of in the Far East, various countries in Vietnam and China, Cambodia, and there had been cases of it, Hong Kong, and there was a real worry that bird flu was going to jump species from birds into humans, and if it did, it was going to be horribly virulent. It was going to have a mortality rate of anywhere between 60 and 80%, which would be horrendous. And so I started doing a lot of research into that. And as I was researching that, it occurred to me that actually this was all very, very similar to something I'd done research on previously. Now, one of the books in the China series was called Snakehead. And it was the only book in the China series not set in China. It was set in the United States, although I had imported my characters from China into the US for the purposes of the story. And the story was about terrorists having isolated the original Spanish flu virus and weaponized it to use in a terrorist atrocity. And And so I had done a huge amount of research at that point into the Spanish flu and how the Spanish flu affected society. Now, we're going back 100 years. But if I wind forward and look now, with hindsight, at everything I know now about the coronavirus and how it's affected our society today, I can look back and say, do you know what? That's exactly what happened 100 years ago during the Spanish flu pandemic. Now, this is beyond living memory. Nobody remembers what it was like, but it was remarkably similar. The cities, countries went into lockdown. Public meetings were cancelled. Workplaces were shut down. Shops were closed. Streets were deserted. It was remarkably similar. And so I'd already done all that research. So I had a good sense of how a pandemic would affect a society. I did further research on the bird flu, and I came up during this research with a number of documents, 2 pandemic preparedness documents that had been prepared by organisations in the United Kingdom. One was a national health document. The other one was the Health Protection Agency, which no longer exists, I have to tell you. But they had both prepared these pandemic preparedness documents to basically plan how government, society, our health services, our public services would cope with a pandemic. And I found a third document which had been prepared by the Americans, another pandemic preparedness document. So I had these blueprints, if you like, for how society would face up to and deal with a pandemic. And taking all this research into account, I sat down and I storylined lockdown. I immediately then, having outlined my story, I jumped on a plane, I went to London, and I went and researched all my locations. And I came back and I wrote the story. I was writing fast. I needed money. I finished the book. It was from my perspective at that point, what I was writing was a fast-paced thriller that would take place in a very concentrated period of time, effectively just 24 hours. And that story would be set against the backdrop of a major Western capital city in complete lockdown because of a viral pandemic, that city being London. And I couldn't get it published. Guess what? 3rd in a row. Here I thought I was on to a winner. That here was something a bit different, something nobody had done before. I'd researched it well. I felt it was it was a roller coaster ride of a read. I mean, I would class it quite differently from likes of The Black House, which is much more like a novel, a more thoughtful examination of the human condition, if you like. This was just a rock and roll thriller ride story through 24 hours in these exceptional circumstances. But I couldn't get it published. And the feedback that I got from publishers was that they thought that my scenario was unrealistic, that, they just couldn't imagine a major Western capital city being shut down by a virus. It just didn't seem realistic to them. They thought it was not so much like crime fiction as like science fiction. So much for making a quick buck. It didn't make me anything except poorer, because again I put out money on my research, the trip to London, all the rest of it. So I was in, by this time I was in desperate straits. 3 books in a row I had written, and over a long career at that stage, these were the first rejections I'd had. So it was hard to take. What's interesting, of course, is being able to look back now is that, The Black House went on to become my breakthrough book and an international bestseller, which has sold millions of copies around the world. and spawned the other two books in what's now called the Lewis trilogy. The Extraordinary People was the first of the Enzo Files, and the Enzo Files went on to be 6 books, which have sold again all around the world. Great bestsellers. So what do publishers know? But these things had happened to those books that had been rejected, The Black House and Extraordinary People. But still, sitting in my metaphorical bottom drawer was the manuscript of Lockdown. I mean, it was actually sitting in my Dropbox file on my computer for 15 years. And to be perfectly honest, I'd totally given up on it. I'd forgotten all about it, really. I had no expectation of it ever being published. And, since then I'd gone on to write about another 10, 12 books or something like that. So, it had disappeared into the mists of time. It was, a moment in my life to be forgotten, if you like. And then, lo and behold, this fateful year of 2020, along comes coronavirus. It starts off as an epidemic in China and spreads throughout the world and becomes a worldwide pandemic and shuts down whole countries, including the UK, including London. And those scenes that I had imagined of empty streets, shops, businesses shuttered up, emergency services stretched to the limit, building emergency hospitals on bits of waste ground. All these things that I had imagined and put into lockdown, suddenly they were all coming true. It was all happening for real. And not only that, but, at the beginning of lockdown, the book, the Prime Minister gets the virus and dies in St Thomas Hospital. And lo and behold, the beginning of the real lockdown in London, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, gets the virus and he's taken into ICU in St Thomas Hospital. And when that was all happening, I can tell you, I was sitting thinking, God, if he dies, I'm going to get the blame for this. As if I'm some kind of Bran seer who saw all this coming. Well, the weird thing is that, and I look back and I think, why didn't I think about it before? But when the real life pandemic started, and I'm here in France, and France has gone into lockdown, and Britain's in lockdown, and Italy, and Spain, and Germany, and all I was really concerned about was the fact that there was a virus out there, and that being the age I was very much at risk, and I knew I had to be very careful about how I went about my business. And I just never connected what was happening in reality with the book that I'd written 15 years earlier. And it wasn't until somebody on my Twitter timeline suggested that I might like to think about writing a thriller set against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic that I suddenly thought, wait a minute, I've done that. And I had. Well, it wasn't coronavirus, it was bird flu. But everything else, to all intents and purposes, was the same. And I went trawling through my Dropbox to find the original manuscript and sat down and read it and was absolutely gobsmacked because, I remembered, of course, what the gist of the story was. But the detail had escaped me. I mean, the detail of what I'd written 15 years earlier, having written another 10 or 12 books since then, the detail had totally escaped me. But as I was reading the manuscript again, I was thinking, oh my God, this so mirrors what's actually happening on the ground now. And it was quite scary. And I didn't know what to do about it. And even then, I wasn't thinking about publication. I mentioned, and it literally was a kind of by the way mention at the end of an email to my editor on a completely different subject. I was kind of, by the way, I have this manuscript of a book I wrote 15 years ago, which is set in London during a pandemic, and the city's locked down, a murder investigation, and he wrote straight back and said, "Send me the manuscript." So I sent him a PDF of it, and the very next morning, I woke up and there was an email in my inbox from my editor. He'd sat up all night reading the book, and he said, "This is brilliant. We have to publish it now." And in a sense, the rest is history. The publishers were affected by lockdown as well. A lot of their staff had been put on furlough. The rest were working from home. And publication schedule had all been pushed away into the future somewhere. Everything had been postponed. And so there was a whole machinery sitting there with nothing to do. And suddenly, my editor put the production of Lockdown, my book, in motion. And the whole publishing machine just swung into action. And we actually went through the whole production process on the manuscript and producing a cover within 2 weeks, which, if anybody knows anything about the publishing industry, they know that that's quite extraordinary. And so 2 weeks later, the book was published as an ebook, on Kindle. 4 weeks after that, it was available as a paperback. It's now, sales are shooting up towards 250,000 now. I still find it hard to believe that a book which I had written that long ago, on which I had completely given up, should suddenly become a major bestseller because of something as awful as a real life pandemic. And I have to confess that when they said we have to publish this and publish it now, I had qualms. It didn't seem to me quite right that I should be profiting from other people's misery, and misery is what this virus has produced. And the awful things that people working in the front line of the National Health Service and the care homes have had to face, and the families who've lost loved ones. It just didn't seem right to me. So I said, okay, if we're publishing this now, then I'm going to donate the entire advance on this book to charities working on the front line against the virus, and that's what I did. And actually, it was great for being able to sit there and decide who really needed money, who really needed cash, where can this money make a difference, and so I was able to do research on that and make sure that the money went to the right sort of places, and so that was very gratifying, and it was a side benefit of the book being published. Of course, not only was it published in the UK, it's now been translated into about 20 different languages and is published in about 30 countries around the world. And my Facebook author page, for example, is getting thousands of hits and thousands of follows from people with strange names from countries all over the place. It's really gone, I hate to use the word viral, in terms of the international marketplace, taken me totally by surprise. But here we are again, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months later, and we're back in lockdown. I mean, for real lockdown. And there's not much to be said about that. I mean, I did, in the spring and early summer when the book came out, I was in huge demand to do interviews from press, radio, television, all over the world. CNN, 24-hour news in Nigeria, India, Spain, Italy, you name it. I was doing interviews from right here in this is my home studio, where I'm able to produce almost broadcast quality video and audio for this kind of thing. So that was great. But in all these interviews, journalists were asking me all the time, as if I was some, as I said before, some kind of seer, some kind of Nostradamus who could predict things that were going to happen in the future, which is absolutely nonsense. I just simply did my research, and what I wrote about is what the research led me to write about, the facts and figures on the ground. And I feel I know quite a lot about it because I did a lot of in-depth research, and when I was being asked, well, how do you see this panning out? What do you think is going to happen? Is it going to be a good outcome? And I found myself saying again and again and again, well, I think the only way out of this is going to be a functioning vaccine. But who knows how long that's going to take? It could be 6 months, a year, 5 years. Who knows? I said, but the one thing for sure, because even by June, we were looking, governments were lifting restrictions. They were easing down on everything. People were going on holidays. They were crowding the beaches. They were going to restaurants and bars. Everything was opening up. And at that time I was saying, this is too much too soon. Really, this is the wrong thing to be doing. We need to ease these restrictions very slowly. And of course, the test and trace, which was crucial to being able to keep the thing under control after we'd been through the lockdown, was a mess. It was a mess. In truth, nobody's really got this right anywhere in the world. They got it even more wrong in Britain, and they're still toiling with it. It's extraordinary. After having thrown all the money at it that they have, they still haven't got it right. And now we're back into the second wave. And the second wave is what I said was going to come. In September, October, there's going to be a second wave, and it's going to be worse than the first time around. And the reason I was able to say that was because the precedent was there. I mean, all the virologists were predicting it anyway. But go back to the Spanish flu. That's exactly what happened. It started in the spring, and it went through that first wave. And then in the summer, everybody relaxed. And it came back with a vengeance in the autumn. And it was lethal right through the autumn and winter into the following spring. And these things follow a pattern. They have seasons. And there are all sorts of unpredictable factors involved in that. But it seemed to me absolutely clear at the time that that's what was going to happen. And yet our governments, not just the British government, the French government, the Italians, the Spanish, the Germans, everybody has been incredibly slow to respond. They were at the beginning far too slow to respond. They could have saved many lives if they'd gone into lockdown more brutally, more quickly. And then if they'd released the restrictions more slowly and developed proper test and trace, then this second wave could have been under control. So I personally, I blame governments for this because it was all there. It was all predictable. And in a way, that's what the writer's job is. It's to look at, stuff on the ground and say, this is what's likely to happen. And this is how it's going to impact on our society. I'll read you a couple of extracts from the book Snakehead that I mentioned before, where I'd done the research for the Spanish flu. I've got it up on my screen here, if I can pull it across, and read you a little bit about it. There's a character, Anatoly Markin, in my book, who's the fictitious head of the former USSR's Biological Weapons Development Organization, a vast entity that developed lethal versions of deadly viruses and bacteria to be used as weapons in direct contravention of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, to which they were signatories and which banned all such activity. Markin might have been fictitious, but he was based on a real person, the man who headed up this organisation and defected to the US in the 90s. The following quotes are taken from a meeting, a fictitious meeting in the book, at USAMRIID. That's the United States Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's set in Maryland. And this scene, he's addressing medical and military experts on the weaponization by terrorists of the Spanish flu virus. The scene, of course, is fictitious, but the place is not. It is the United States' own bioweapons development center. And I've been there. This is, let me see if I can pull this up now. Here we go. This is what Markin is telling this meeting. He says, we know virtually nothing about why the 1918 flu was so virulent and so deadly. And many doctors believe that it is only a matter of time before a similar pandemic strikes again, that we are, in fact, merely in an interpandemic period. And that, to be honest, that's all my research said that. Every virologist I spoke to said we are in an interpandemic period. Markin goes on, for medical science to be able to study the Spanish flu virus and know what made it such a killer would go a long way to enabling us to protect ourselves against a future attack. So really, we should and could always have been aware of what it is that viruses can do to us if they become pandemics, if we let them become pandemics. And that's what all these pandemic preparedness documents about. Anyway, Markin goes on, the Spanish flu was incredibly infectious. In 1918, American people stopped going out of their homes. If they did, they wore face masks. Shops were shut. Public meetings were cancelled. Funerals were banned. Some more isolated communities put armed guards on the roads into their towns and villages and shot anyone who approached. Today, with modern travel, increased communications, increased populations, the death toll would be devastating. We could be talking about hundreds of millions of people. Hospitals and public health services simply couldn't cope. They would quickly break down. No one would be immune. Soldiers, police officers, health workers, they would all be as vulnerable as anybody else. A complete breakdown of law and order would almost certainly follow. So this was the kind of stuff I'd been writing based on my researches that fed, of course, into what I ultimately wrote about in lockdown. It's been a roller coaster ride. Some people hate the book, feel it's something they don't particularly want to read at this depressing time, and I can understand that. A lot of people have loved it. I've had phenomenal feedback on it, and remarkably, a lot of people have talked. The word they have used about reading the book is comfort. People seem to take comfort from reading about something they can relate to very directly. The experience we're going through today in relation to this pandemic. In a sense, it makes people feel not so alone, not so isolated. Other people are experiencing the same thing. And that was something that I had to face up to quite directly in writing my next book, the book that I'm currently writing. I'm probably about 2 weeks away from finishing it. And this was a book that, in a sense, was shaped by the pandemic also, because I'd spent over the winter and early spring a lot of time researching and developing an idea for a book which was going to be set in the archipelago of Svalbard in the Arctic Circle, way to the north of Norway. And I had done all the work. I had storylined it. I developed on my characters. All I needed to do was the research trip, and that was all booked up for May. And of course, along comes the pandemic, and I had to cancel it all. A lot of the money that got put out on that, I was unable to recover as well. So that was a really tough one, because I was due to deliver a book by the end of this year. And the book that I had intended to write across the summer was no longer a viable option because I couldn't do the location research for it. So I had to come up with something else, something completely new, something also that I could research from here, from home, without travelling. And so I ended up, I'm not going to go into detail about what the book's about, but it's set here in the area that I live in. and the locations involved are places that I know. Fortunately, during the summer when restrictions were not so severe, I was able to go and do some very specific location research on these places, which none of which are any more than about half an hour from where I live. And the book takes place, there are two timelines. One is contemporary, and the other is set during the Second World War. So, I mean, I was able to do all my research for that, obviously on the internet and with books that I have here. But the big question, which and not just I, but any writer writing right now has to face is, do they take account of the changes that have affected our society as a result of this pandemic? Now, as it happens, the story I'm writing, it takes place this autumn 2020. And so I felt there was no way I could ignore the pandemic. I couldn't just pretend that it didn't exist, that people weren't wearing masks or gelling their hands or socially distancing. I had to take that into account. And so that, to an extent, coloured the way that I was writing the contemporary story thread. And then, of course, it was actually originally being written to have taken place in November. It's always a bit tricky writing something in the future, even if it's only a month in the future, because lo and behold, last week the French president comes on television Wednesday night and says, we're going into national lockdown. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm writing a story which takes place in November this year, and I haven't taken any account of there being a lockdown. Yes, the pandemic restrictions and behaviours that have been forced upon us, but not a lockdown. So I've had to move my story back about 2 to 3 weeks, and I've actually been able to use the fact that we've gone into lockdown again here in France as a story trigger towards the end of the story, because it then puts pressure. This is an Enzo book, I have to tell you. I've gone back to Enzo for this one. It's suddenly put pressure for Enzo to get this done before the midnight deadline when lockdown comes into force, because after that he's not going to be free to move around. So, it's affected the book I'm currently writing, and no doubt will affect anything I might write in the future. But and it's a question that anybody writing just now has to ask themselves: do I take account of this? And I think you have to. I don't think you can ignore it. This is a major social phenomenon that we are all living through, and I don't think you can just pretend it's not there. I mean, I watch TV shows set before the pandemic struck, and it all seems a bit unrealistic to me. Don't kiss, don't shake hands, stand further apart. It doesn't feel right. And so I think anything being written now should really take account of that. Anyway, I'm not going to witter on for very much longer. I have been sent a number of questions from readers, which I will now endeavour to answer. If I can drag these across here to let me see. So the first of these comes from Katrina from Jamestown. And Katrina asks, how much research do you put into your crime novels? Well, I think you probably know from what I've been discussing in relation to lockdown that I do a lot of research. And all my books are thoroughly researched. In fact, and I have to tell you that I probably enjoy the research as much as, if not more than, the writing. Research is something I learned to do during the 1970s when I was working as a journalist. And you're trained really in that process to be fearless in the pursuit of information, facts and figures, views and opinions. You pick up a phone and you ask somebody. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they're the Chancellor of the Exchequer or a Prime Minister, or, you go for it. And I've carried that through into my writing of books, and thoroughly enjoy the process of research, and I like to think that when I do my research, I get 99.9% of it right. Not just in terms of the factual content, but also in terms of the location I go. I never write about a place I haven't been to, which is why I couldn't write the Svalbard book, because I hadn't been to it. So and I like to think that my readers trust me, that they trust that I've done my research, that I'm getting my facts right, and that if I write about a place, that's what it's like, and that I can take them with me on that journey so they experience it the way I did. So research is very important to me. Here's somebody else in Jamestown. Caroline this time in Jamestown. She asks, do you think that crime fiction is taken more seriously as literature in France than in the UK? Well, in a word, Caroline, yes. When I could not get The Black House published, one of the reasons that crime editors in the UK wouldn't publish was because they thought it was too literary. In a way, it took the Scandinavians to educate British publishers in the literary crime novel. Deep, psychological, dark stories set in cold northern places. Now, there was an appetite. People wanted to read these stories. Publishers just didn't know or understand that at that time. But the French did. The French have a genre called the roman noir, literally the black novel. And it's treated as literature, as a novel. There's a much higher regard here in France for crime fiction as literature than in the UK, and I think that still persists. I think there's still a kind of, to an extent, a snobbery about what makes a novel and what makes a crime book. I don't see why a book cannot encompass both. Anyway, we'll move on to a question from John in Clydebank. John says, I understand that you worked for a while as a private detective. What was that experience like, and has it influenced your writing? Well, I did work as a private detective, John, for nearly a year. But I have to say it was a virtual experience. I was a virtual private detective in a virtual world. Because I wrote a book called Virtually Dead, which is set in a virtual world called Second Life, which is accessed through the internet, through a special browser. And there you create your avatar, and your avatar reacts to and interrelates with lots of other avatars, male, female, and everything in between, including furries. In a world which is remarkably similar to our own, everything in Second Life is created by the people who inhabit Second Life, its residents. There's some just basic pixelated areas of land, I suppose you could call it, and people develop that. They landscape it, they create buildings, they build shops, and they make things to sell in the shops. And they create services that they also sell, and in many, many, many ways, it's just like our world, except you can fly, and you can teleport from one location to another, which is very convenient. It saves a lot of time. But people are people, and people are the same in a virtual world as they are in the real world. People interact, they meet other people, they fall in love, they have relationships, they fall out of love, they break up relationships. It's not at all dissimilar to the real world. And when I went in to Second Life, it was to research this idea for a book set in that virtual world. I decided to set up a detective agency. My avatar's name was Flick Folds. I liked the name Folds because it was a good Scottish name. And So I set up the Flickfolds Detective Agency, with no expectations at all that anybody would want to engage my services. But I advertised it, and I got inundated. All sorts of cases I was confronted with, but most of them were about infidelity. I would say 90% of the cases were about infidelity. People who suspected that their in-world lovers or wives or husbands were cheating on them with another avatar, and they wanted me to find it, track them down, photograph them, catch them in flagrante delicto. And I did that, and actually earned a lot of what they call Linden dollars. That's the local currency in Second Life. It was an extraordinary experience, and very much influenced the book that I wrote, Virtually Dead, which has until now only been published in the United States and in France. It was due to come out as an ebook in the UK this month or next month, but because of the unexpected publication this year of lockdown on top of my standard annual book, A Silent Death, they decided to postpone publication until next year. So Virtually Dead will come out as an ebook next year. It's very different from my other books, but it was very much shaped by the actual world of Second Life and the people that I met there. It was quite an experience, I have to say. Now, another one from Clydebank, from Anne this time. Do you find it funny that lockdown was rejected because the publishers thought that it was unrealistic and could never happen? Funny is not the word I would use. Ironic, I guess, is how I would describe it at the end of the day. I didn't feel any great sense of achievement in its eventual publication simply because of the circumstances in which it was published, and the misery and the sickness and death that people were facing on a daily basis. So, you know, it really was a double-edged sword for me. In a way, I would be happier today if that manuscript was still gathering dust in my Dropbox folder, because it would mean that there had been no such thing as this coronavirus pandemic, and I think we would all be a lot happier for that. Finally, there's a question from Alison from Renton. What sort of perspective do you get on Scotland from living in France? Are you nostalgic or more critical? Well, that's an interesting question, Alison. The perspective from France, yes, I get a very different perspective, I would say. I mean, I lived in Scotland until I was 50. So 50 years, half a century I had living in Scotland, born and brought up there. I had worked there all my life. And my last kind of major experience there had been Macher, creating and producing Macher during the 1990s, which had been a phenomenal experience, and it had introduced me to the Outer Hebrides. Which I had a real love-hate relationship with them, but ultimately a deep love for the place. And when I quit TV in '96 to try and make a living writing books, I think the last thing on my mind was writing about Scotland. In fact, the first thing that I wrote was set in China, and the China series, and that was the next 5, 6, 7 years of my life was spent a large part of it in China and backwards and forwards and writing about this very strange and alien culture. And in the middle of that, writing that series, I moved to France. And when I finished the China series, there I was living in another country. And of course, I'm then looking back on my life and the country I used to live in, and thinking that unique experience I'd had living and working in the Isle of Lewis during those years in the 90s was really something I should write about. And of course, it was nearly 10 years later, and I was living in another country. I was looking back. So I had quite a different sense of it all, a different perspective. And I really think that I needed that time and distance to be able to write about it. Had I stayed in Scotland, I might never have written about the Outer Hebrides, just because in a sense it was too close to home and too close to me and too close to my own experience. It took that distance to be able to successfully write about it. So yes, but I'm, you know, it doesn't make me more critical about Scotland. I was probably more critical of Scotland when I was there. I probably have a more romantic notion about it now. And I've always said that if Scotland ever did become an independent country, I would come back to make sure that that I paid my taxes in Scotland, because, you know, it would make me happy. It would make me happier to pay my taxes to the Scottish Exchequer than the British Exchequer or the French Exchequer. Put it that way. Yes, I miss it, but you know, I've always been able to come back, I find myself now sitting here during this pandemic, looking at, you know, Facebook posts that I've made, you know, about trips to the Isle of Lewis, and thinking, gosh, am I ever going to be back there? Is it ever going to be possible for me to go back? And that's a sad thought. I mean, the thought that I somehow wouldn't ever be able to go back to my own country. Yeah, I would choke up on that. So, I'm wherever I am in the world, and I have French nationality now, but, you know, whatever else, I am Scottish and will always be Scottish. So that's me. I'll leave you to it, and I hope everybody has a great book week, and that you're going to get tons of reading done over this winter during this lockdown period. Make sure you pick good books. See you next time. Bye-bye.